Barefoot, Escape on the Underground Railroad. Written by Pamela Duncan Edwards. Illustrated by Henry Cole. The Barefoot didn't see the eyes watching him as he ran onto the overgrown pathway. His breath came in great gasps. In the hours since he had run from the plantation, he had traveled faster and farther than ever in his life. He was fearful of what lay before him. He was terrified of what lay behind. The heron's keen eyes had spotted the Barefoot moving furtively toward the pathway. The heron's warning cry had been a signal to the other animals. They had seen many bare feet along their pathway, and they had seen some of them being led away in ropes by the heavy boots. The Barefoot stopped and leaned wearily against the trunk of a loblolly pine. He raised the bottle to his lips. It was empty, and no water flowed to his mouth. Then, from a few feet away, came the urgent croaking of a frog. It sang out in its message into the night, "Fresh water, fresh water." The Barefoot moved toward the sound and drank deeply. Looking back along the pathway, the Barefoot made a decision. He sank down in the tall marsh grass, his head on his arms. There was a rustling sound, his heart pounding. The Barefoot slowly raised his head and saw a white-footed mouse nibbling a wild berry. The white-footed mouse scurried away as the Barefoot reached for a handful of berries, stuffing them into his mouth with a frantic hunger. From the branches of the cherry tree, a mockingbird began to sing. Looking up at the tree, the Barefoot watched a squirrel disappearing into its nest of twigs and leaves. With an exhausted sigh, the Barefoot pulled a thick blanket of leaves over himself. He closed his eyes and rested. But the heron's standing sentinel broke the silence. His warning cry echoed along the pathway. The heavy boots were closing in on their prey. It was too late for the Barefoot to find safety. Loud voices and trampling feet grew nearer. "We'll get him," cried a voice. "He'll soon be back where he belongs," laughed another. One of the heavy boots kicked a rock in his path. Suddenly, out of the grass rose an army of mosquitoes. The heavy boots stopped within inches of where the Barefoot lay. Dozens of mosquitoes attacked, biting hands and faces and through clothing. The heavy boots moved away from the marsh grass, slapping and cursing. Ahead of them, a shape darted across the pathway. A cracking of branches brought cries of, "There he is!" as the heavy boots crashed their way into the thick undergrowth. They cursed again and slashed at green briar and poison ivy as the deer led them farther and farther away from where the Barefoot lay trembling. The mosquitoes returned to their hideaways amid the grass. The mockingbird sang again. The Barefoot looked at his body in awe. Not one mosquito bite was to be seen. Hidden along the pathway, The animals watched the Barefoot. He walked straighter than before, knowing he had eluded his pursuers. The pathway opened out to a wider area. Trees had been felled and logs stacked as if for a fire. Standing a little way off was a house. The animals heard a quick intake of the Barefoot's breath. Did this house represent safety or danger? The Barefoot strained to see the house, but the moon remained behind thick clouds. Then, out from the trees flew firefly after firefly. Their tiny lanterns sparkled and flashed as the Barefoot moved silently forward. His eyes suddenly made out the shape of a quilt hanging in front of the house. This was the signal of welcome for which the Barefoot had been hoping. As he reached the quilt, a door opened and a warm light flooded through. With wonder on his face, the Barefoot glanced back at the pathway he had traveled. He slipped through the door, the noises of the animals following him. To the Barefoot's ears, the sounds were a salute to courage. Silence fell again along the pathway, and the animals slept. But through their dreams, the heron's cry once again screamed a warning. Another Barefoot was approaching. And this little author's note in the back says, the pathway along which the runaway slave in the story traveled was part of the Underground Railroad, a network of courageous people who helped pass runaways from one safe house to another northward to freedom. There were many signals used to show a runaway that it was safe to approach a house. Special songs, a lantern shining from a particular window, and often a quilt hung over a porch rail or a clothesline. When the Barefoot saw the quilt hanging in front of the house in the clearing, he knew he would be safe until he continued his journey the following night. Most slaves, like the Barefoot, had worked in plantation fields at some time. They were familiar with animal signs. The Barefoot knew there must be fresh water nearby when he heard the frog croaking. Of course, the animals had no idea they were helping this brave Barefoot. Or do you think perhaps they did? It's the end of Barefoot.